Yeah. Bring on Bernie.
How can you follow that up? Well, you can try. So I've got a significant challenge ahead of me today, not only trying to condense some insights from the world's largest social graph into 40 minutes, but also keep your attention as the blood sugar plummets on our way to lunch. So I'll try not to keep you, try not to keep in between you and lunch, and so we'll run through this relatively quickly. But before I start, I do like to do sort of a non-visually aided introduction to the talk and then actually give it. This talk is, like many, a sort of a smashed together amalgam of various different pieces, research of mine, research of other people's, where I'm trying to assert a couple different things. The first one, and I think perhaps the broadest takeaway, is that social media can be analyzed at a multitude of scales, but even when we get right down to the most personal scale, there's a lot of very compelling and interesting things to discover, and that those things are actionable. We can work with it, and we can. Oh yes, I'm number 3. And we can do interesting work that's both sort of computer tech savvy, state of the art, but also sociologically meaningful. The second thing that I'd like to bring forward is that not all ways of doing research with data, with big data and accessible data, are appropriate, and that there's ways to get yourself into both legal hot water and just bad PR by not thinking through a lot of the issues involved in data collection. And I'll give examples of that here, both some good studies that I think really did a great job of being sensitive to these issues on Facebook, and some not so good studies that, while being very germane and very important from a sociological point of view, also have really challenged the limits of what we think is appropriate for ethically for data. And then finally, I just want to flog my own personal work, of course, both my HCI-esque work looking at interactive Facebook diagrams. We'll render a nice interactive diagram of the webshop group at the end of this thing, but also an assertion that there are some ways that we can think about the difference between us, our lived identity, our identity in situ, in the present here at any given point in situations, and us as the sort of digital traces that we leave behind and that we use to construct profiles, construct identities online, and that we have to have a lot of different kinds of considerations when we think about what it means to leave data traces, how they both enable us to speak to the world, but also silence us by making us feel self-censored or surveyed. And so those are kind of the 3 takeaways, and perhaps we can get rolling on that. So yes, of course, again, starting with Facebook, a lovely website here. Maybe this is what people first thought of Facebook as just a flurry of faces, different people that you might know. These are Radio 4 listeners. It's part of a study I did for the So You Want to Be a Scientist competition on Radio 4. This was amateurs who had a scientific, or what they thought was a scientific idea, and then they worked with a mentor in order to actualize that idea. So they called me up and said, we'd like you to be a mentor. I thought it was quite flattering, because I guess that means then, implicitly, I am a scientist. So this was quite reassuring, or at least the BBC thinks so. I'm not sure what they know. But perhaps a fair bit. So we put this together, and we found that people do a lot of different interesting things with their profile picture on Facebook, but they tend to not show themselves drinking or smoking. Radio 4 listeners. So bear this in mind. Couples tend to, people who are in couples tend to show themselves smiling more frequently. Women smile more frequently than men. People tend to show themselves in sort of significant life course moments, and we've got some models on this, and yada, yada, yada. But suffice to say, people are very careful with their profiles. But there's other ways to look at Facebook, of course. One is this nice political statement right here. Anybody? Yes, a political statement. No, isn't this just Facebook? No, it's not self-evident. It says a couple different things. The first thing it says, Facebook is very dominant in North America and Europe. The second thing it says that it is globally connected, but there are places that are excluded. The excluded places, you can, there's a really lovely map that overlays this with the NASA map of lights at night, demonstrating that there are stark differences in why it's excluded in different places. One, For example, in Russia and China, it's excluded because there's different social networking sites that are very active there, and less prominent in Brazil because there's another social networking site very active there. In Brazil, it used to be Orchid, although Orchid is receding. In Russia, you start off with Class or LiveJournal, moving to Classmates, and more recently in Contact or the Contact. And in China, YY, RenRen, QQ. So you can see a picture here. And Weibo. Yes, these are, Facebook is not simply a totalizing force, even if it has 900 million members across the world. But the political statement is saying, look, we are global, but after the first glance, you have to be mindful of these exclusions that are there. And of course, in Africa, it's relatively sparse, but that's as much a function of the lack of broader internet connectivity as it is of migration to other social network platforms. But maybe this is how you think about Facebook these days, which is the plummeting stock. I won't leave that on too long. But nevertheless, I guess I will. Nevertheless, there's still a lot of data there, even if it's exclusive, even if it's sliced and diced in some way. There's a lot of data. Why don't we just grab that data and see what we can do with it? Well, that's what Pete Worden did, and it got him into a whole lot of hot water. What he argued that because he didn't join Facebook, he wasn't bound by the terms of service, which says don't spider the site. And so he took all of the publicly available friendship links that he could find from the address book. At the time, this was 200 million of 400 million user profiles. But those 200 million profiles were linked to the other ones that weren't exposed. So it drew a pretty massive graph. And he said, oh, I'm going to release this graph as a wonderful social science tool. And that didn't last very long before the lawyers went after him, and as well as privacy scholars. And one of whom, oh, that's not the right computer. One of whom, and this is also a pet trick for other web shoppers. In my cohort in Web Shop in 2003, I was sitting right here, and Michael Zimmer was sitting right there. And Esther showed up later on, but she was presenting my year. She was in the Web Shop the year prior as a student. Michael was saying, this is an absolutely horrible idea. You can't just release all this data, and he gets into a pretty long discussion of some of the reasons why it's inappropriate, but ultimately the lawyers at Facebook were the main force in this. Pete Worden has gone on to other interesting things, like pointing out that your iPhone can track you where you are, and he built an application to show you this and do some really interesting and compelling research. But this was a bit of a blunder, and it's a blunder for people like me who download ego networks in Facebook. And if I then produce an ego network or show an ego network, now if you have this entire data set, you can reinsert the ego network into that full data set, and now so you can de-anonymize and do all sorts of things that mitigate against privacy. Facebook themselves have also sort of taken another turn with this lately, which is saying if you have the means and a good research question, you can come to Menlo Park and work on data, so they don't need to release this to the world. This has become increasingly important with insights such as the 3.74 degrees of separation on Facebook that was published by Lars Backstrom and colleagues, and it can't really be verified by anyone else because no one else gets that data. So they say, well, you can come to Menlo Park and reanalyze it using your algorithms, and we'll work that way. There's other ways to get data, and so I sort of covered what it said there. And this one is another data set that landed people in hot water, which is now, again, under lock and key. It's still available, and has led to some excellent research papers. There's one in AJS, there's one in JCMC, there's one in PNAS, and any other acronyms? I don't know. CIA, FBI, ICQ. ICQ. What? Who's heard that in 12 years? Anyway, the idea was that in the old days, and so I've been doing a similar thing in this group, incidentally, so we can have a meta discussion about that. I'm probably not going to get to my own work, but this is okay because I think this is probably more useful. I've been so in the olden days of Facebook, there were these things called networks, and a network was a term for a specific locale or area. Say there was the Toronto network and it had 1 million people, and then there was the Harvard network and it had people who went to Harvard. And you could join these. You didn't need to be from Harvard or from Toronto. You just sort of assumed you'd join them. I thought they were really great for being able to see who was who in your network, but subsequently the API released all that data anyway. The idea, however, though, is that there was for a little window of time, there was a nice little privacy bug in there, so that if you were in the Toronto network, you could see the friendship links of all the other people in the Toronto network. And then, so what they did at Harvard is said, oh great, we can use this data to build the networks of students at Harvard. They built these networks. They went to the oh, is it supposed to be Harvard? It's now been so we're going to go somewhere at this. At this university in the Northeast, yada yada, all this language. Put all this together, and they put this together with demographic information. Harvard collects a lot that was shared, things like parental SES, where people were staying in dorms, and then this was supposed to be a Drosophila of networks. But they said, well, we have to make sure it's anonymized. So they, in the code book, there's things like, here's the people taking near Middle Eastern languages, there's 700 people in this cohort, or 1,700 people in this cohort, and so forth, which means you didn't have to go into the data set, you didn't have to use high-performance computing, you just had to Google, colleges in the Northeast with near Middle Eastern language courses, and you're left with 3, one of which has a cohort of that size, so now you can figure out it's Harvard. So there was a giant stink over this. This was also done without the students' consent, even though it was public. So this was what it said there. Oh, we're gonna have our data set, release it, and then say the T3 data set is still offline and will take further steps to ensure the privacy of students in the data set. Please check back later for additional updates. I mean, very lawyerly. We're not going to pull this up. And then there's of course a backlash. Is there a Michael Zimmer slide? Yes. And he's got a great paper on this called "But the Data is Already Public," and it's worth reflecting on this, that some data is public-ish, and that if you're taking this data without the consent of people, you ought to be mindful of it. Now, incidentally, the reason I said that we're doing something like this today is because normally, and I'm going to sort of migrate into EgoNet discussions. In an EgoNet, if Ben and Mark are friends, and I'm friends with both of them, Facebook will tell me if they're friends. If Ben and Mark are friends, but I'm only friends with Mark, Facebook won't tell me anything about Ben, unless we're all in a group together. So I don't have to be all of your friends to download the network of friendship relations on Facebook, if and only if we're in a group together. So everybody's in this group, and that's why we posted that picture, and so forth. But yes, it is a bit of a privacy hack, and something worth being particularly mindful of in your own work and which groups you subscribe to. I won't go through this data set, but this is another way to get it. This was back before Facebook even realized the value of social network data, and so Mason Porter at Caltech at the time, he's now a professor at Oxford, said, hey, can I have all this data? And they said, okay, here you are. And basically just gave them the college, the affiliation, the gender, the cohort, and the friendship graph for the first 100 schools on Facebook. And so that data set is available. However, that data set has been scrubbed very, very delicately and can be still available publicly for use as a consequence of, once bitten, twice shy, being sensitive to how to release these data and how not to release them. Didn't stop Michael Zimmer from complaining, though. That's okay. He was a sharp guy here as well. So just, it's important one does not simply walk into Facebook data. But we can, so here's some examples of studies that I thought did a lovely job with it. Gilbert and Karahalios, Eric Gilbert, Carrie Karahalios, when Eric was a graduate student at UIUC, did a Grease Monkey script, put it in a browser, said, tell me, are these people really close to each other? And then downloaded a whole bunch of data from them, and then showed a nice regression model showing that you could predict tide strength based on trace data. The other thing that's worth noting is that in this paper, there's a whole bunch of sort of fictitious or stylized profiles, and he's very sensitive to the distinction between, I have the data to analyze, and this is what you need to see it, but you don't need to see a real Facebook network, you don't need to see everyone's real profile photos in order to accomplish that. Here's another really wonderful paper by Sanam Aral and Dylan Walker. Sanam was sitting over there in my year in Webshop, and he was dynamite then and he's dynamite now. Man, this guy, just keep an eye on him. So this is the early version of the paper. The more recent one has been published in a little journal called Science. He's doing all right. And he's at a business school. But it's really interesting what you can do there in terms of A/B testing on Facebook. And he's looking at this movie site. I can't remember which one, or he didn't tell me, or it doesn't matter. But sending out these status message updates, hey, you should join this site. And one group gets to the opportunity to do this by personalizing messages. Another group gets to select which of their network to send. And another group gets to blast it to the network. And so they examined where did the uptake happen most effectively. And as you may or may not think, if you blast it out, you get the most people uptaking the movie database. However, if you look at it down the line, most of those people didn't stay with the movie recommending database. The ones who did the personalized message, it was more expensive, but the people that they chose were very effective in staying on the site, or it was a very effective way to diffuse this. So, which is another way of saying, in the naive sense, you think it's a good idea to spam all of your friends with Cafe Press and Farmville updates, but in terms of the long-term adoption patterns, you both reduce the amount of noise on Facebook and succeed in retaining people by allowing for personalized messages. Great insight, and didn't involve downloading and sharing any sorts of data. Here's some other ones. This is stuff that you can do when you're at Facebook or with people at Facebook. Moira Burke, who wasn't at Facebook at the time, but worked with Cameron Marlowe and Tom Lento. Guess who was also at Webshop that year? I know, Tom Lento. Do I actually study anybody who wasn't in this room that year? Honestly, I'm not sure. It was a good time. But yeah, so Tom was sitting there at Webshop that year. So no sort of geographic homophily based on interests. And so what they looked at is the idea that there was this series of studies. Nicole Ellison, Cliff Lampy, Chip Steinfeld started this sort of real trend, real flood towards looking at social capital on Facebook. This notion of positive social resources that you get. And they had this curious finding that, you know, more time people spend on Facebook, the more they would report social capital or positive social capital. I say this with a sort of a quasi-causal implication, but that's partially because not only did they look at it, you know, in a cross-sectional study, but they did look at it long-term, and they found that there were increases, and so those that were on Facebook longer were, you know, doing this or getting more social capital. Or increasing amount of social capital. So, okay, that seems kind of cool, but how can we make use of that other than say, get on Facebook, you'll be able to get a job from your friends or something? Well, so since then, there's been a lot of work looking at how to disentangle that in terms of what are the, what kinds of behavior on Facebook is working. And here's one example of a paper that does that. And then Jen wasn't at Webshop, but she's here, or at this university, I believe, right? Yeah, of course, of course.
She
She's
spoke
actually
at
good.
Webshop last year,
Okay, good.
and that made her career, right?
Yeah, that's what I figured that. Okay, good. Ooh, well, imagine if they weren't at Webshop. Would we even cite them? Yes, and so you can do also lots of other things, predicting personality, again, pulling down data, and then using personality tests and so forth. Really wonderful, plausible stuff. So here's the sort of things that I do with this. I was really interested in my graduate school days about how to capture this sort of vague notion of a personal network, the network that people act on. When I need a favor, who do I call? When I'm stuck at the airport, what sort of media do I use? If I have a life crisis, who do I self-disclose this to? And so forth and so forth. And getting this out of people is really difficult. The earliest sort of name generator techniques, I believe Patrick in the audience here is working a lot on name generators. He's saying, I'm working to improve them. That's because they're terrible. They're really tedious things to do. The earliest ones is list off 6 people. And now does Bob know Charlie? Does Bob know Dave? Does Bob know Ethan? Does Bob know Fred? Does Charlie know Dave? Does Charlie know? And so forth and so forth. And you do that with 6 people and people get kind of a bit miffed. People know more than 6 people. You start doing this with the 20, 30, 40 people in the sort of active network, people go cross-eyed. So I was looking at a way to do this with pen and paper. It was a lot of fun. You can see that visualizing personal networks or something is the paper. And but then I figured, could there possibly be a sort of, trying to monitor time here. Could there possibly be a way to do this with existing trace network data? So I came up with this hideous little thing right here. Called NameGenWeb. I wouldn't recommend going to NameGenWeb because of what Elizabeth was just previously talking about. Facebook had magically changed their API and it's broken. But the development version, we have fixed this and it's quite robust, so you can go to NameGenDev and check this out. So you can, with this, download a Facebook network and then visualize it, look at it. And so we've used this in a multitude of studies now, drawing down those Facebook networks and sort of interpreting them relative to a whole host of issues, whether it's relative to survey data, whether it's visualizing in the lab and showing people their network relative to what they drew, whether it's hacking this tool to use it to get a large-scale group network, and there's a lot of fun plastic things we can do with that. But ultimately it was usable and miserable, so I got some grant funding and now it looks sexy and like almost like Mac-like, because I have a wonderful graduate student, Joshua Melville, who's got a real good sense of fit and finish on these things. And again, name Gen Dev is the one that works, not this one. You don't have to click that consent box right there. That's to say, for a 4-hour grant, we have to contact some people and say, did this tool work? So you can do it without that sort of consent there. You can just get the data, but we would like to ping you at it at some point. More recently, we have then made this into a nice interactive diagram that you can point and click and see parts of your network. And it was a real triumph to have us be able to do this, visualize it all in the browser, have it interactive in the browser so that we don't have to download other tools, go through install processes, or deal with Flash or Java applets, because both are heavy and not good for uptake. In between this one, where it was ugly, and this one that's more pretty, the algorithm stayed pretty stable, and we feel that there was other ways that you can do stuff with it. Now this, for example, while you can sort of be interactive, you can basically mouse over and click. But what if you want to analyze this network in all sorts of interesting ways? And so we took the underlying engine and worked with the Social Media Research Foundation. Myself, Mark Smith, Arbor Seni, primarily, Arbor being the dev on this, putting together the social net importer for NodeXL to allow you to download Facebook networks through that as well. So why did we want to do this? Well, one of the things is that, as I was saying, at the EgoNet level, there's lots of interesting questions that you can ask. And one that I mentioned is social capital. Social capital is sort of being on the rise. So as an example of one study I did of this, we first considered social network measures as indicators of social capital. So if you have a larger network, you ought to have more social capital. If you have a network with more different clusters, that might be a network that has a greater diversity of information. If you have a network that's denser, you have a network that's more protective and more robust. And so we defined these measures. We calculated them for a series of students at a Midwestern university. Just look who's on the paper, and I'm pretty sure we're allowed to say, but anyway, you go guess or go snoop. And we found through this ugly regression table, which I'll summarize for you rather than expect you to read, was that the lead author on this, a graduate student at Ohio University at the time, and now a graduate student at Michigan State University, was looking at class and socioeconomic status. And he found that socioeconomic background, once you've controlled for a lot of other factors, actually did not predict a diversity of groups, diversity of different social clusters in these Facebook networks. And those factors were things like their friending patterns, their extracurricular activities, and the extent to which they were engaged in different worlds. Now, I don't want to hang too far on that story, because who are the people that are able to engage in extracurricular activities, and who are the people that feel comfortable friending lots of other individuals? And so that model is a little more complicated, and I'm not going to show it. But one thing we also notice is that, oddly enough, the average degree of an individual's network, as in, I know people who know lots of other people. People I know have very dense connections. That was very strongly correlated with socioeconomic status, which is a finding we have replicated, but we're not really sure what it means. But what we think is that the higher the socioeconomic status, the more people assume that it's okay to hang out with the popular people, or assume that it's okay to befriend those, or think that that's the way that friending is supposed to work. And as a consequence, you see the replication on Facebook of pre-existing inequalities, where wealthy consider themselves as more central and friend as such, whereas people of less privileged backgrounds assume less of their ability to befriend others. But that's just a tantalizing quasi-finding that we would like to pursue in more detail. But beyond that, I say, social network structure, well, it isn't social capital, is it? So certainly there must be a better way to study social capital than that. So yes, certainly there is. There are scales of these things, lovely scales. Dimitri Williams at Northwestern's come up with a really nice distillation of the, what?
USC.
Oh, is he at USC now? Oh my God, how long have I
He's
been?
actually not
He's
no,
not-
we would have loved to have him.
Didn't he? I thought he was there. I'm so sorry.
He's visiting.
He's visiting.
He was in Illinois.
Where was he in
Illinois?
He was in Illinois. So completely fact checked. Sorry, actually, this is another way of testing whether or not Nash is paying attention. As a point of trivia, yeah, and whether you can hear me in the back. So yes, you can hear me in the back. Dimitri, if you're watching, I'm really sorry. USC is a great place. A lot of nice people. I don't know who else I'm mentioning for USC there at the moment in this talk, but I'm sure you'll mention somebody. Yeah, so Dimitri, coming up, great scale, distilling down God knows how many items. I believe it was 45 or 50 potential items of social resources into these two scales, which kind of seemed like a bridging scale and a bonding scale, where bridging meant a feeling, a sense of being tapped into the world around you, a sense of connectedness, a broader sense of community. And here are the, Facebook makes me feel like part of a larger community, yada, 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 willing to spend time. These measures hang together really well, really high alpha, really nice predictive power in a lot of different studies. There's also a bonding scale, which is formatted differently, but also hangs together really well with things like, could someone loan you $500, or do you use the help from people on Facebook in times of need, and so forth. And this is more, intimate social resources, a sense of being connected to people that you know. For the sociologists in the room, you might find the notion that job advice is in the bonding scale sort of curious, because job advice, vis-a-vis the notion of the strength of weak ties, is something we often thought that would happen from our weak ties that are far away. But nevertheless, in this scale, it seems to be interpreted as a bonding measure. Anyway, we looked at that, we looked at the way people actually acted on Facebook, and came up with some models for networks. Oh yes, so then what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at network structure on Facebook. Does it actually impact those social capital measures, or is it really the stuff that so Moira was doing, just the way people behave on Facebook? And so one of the things that we wanted to do was look at these sort of clusters on Facebook. Here's a stylized example of how one might cluster a Facebook network. This was my network. This is also the obligatory slide. I show this in virtually every talk. And it hasn't been updated in 3 years, although my network has. But I think it's sort of pretty in some right. The black squares, for those of you that are curious, are people that I denoted as being personally close offline. And so something that's worth noting is that those people tend to cross multiple groups, which is also a way of problematizing the notion that you can group a network, that sometimes those network groups overlap, and the people who are the most important tend to be people who overlap in these groups. But nevertheless, we can still count the number of groups. I have people from family, high school, undergraduate, grad school, professional, and so forth and so forth. We get these numbers. We use a spiffy community detection method to denote the number of groups, and we come up with models. I'll spare you most of the models, although in theory you'll be able to read the paper. We're not sure. You can get a draft of it, but it's still in submission after several months. So neither yay nor nay, yay or nay. But one thing that we found that was really interesting, and again, this was a surprise for us. The bonding scale is something that you would expect to be related to people being really densely connected with each other. If I have lots of friends who know my friends, shouldn't I have a really good sense that they can provide resources for me? Well, it's funny because the way that networks work on Facebook is that if you have a really dense network, what you have is a really dense high school group and a really dense work group and very few people who know each other. Whereas if you have a less dense, less clustered network on Facebook, what you have is a couple people from high school and from the sports team, and these people know these people, and these people know these people, and there's lots of crisscrossing connections. So the measurement says the network has a lower clustering coefficient. The network is not as tightly bound, but from the perspective of the individual, it feels like a single cohesive network. It feels like a thing, that Facebook is a known quantity, and not, oh, my family's on Facebook, and my workmates are on Facebook. And so people like this, with this sort of low transitivity scores, actually report much higher bonding, whereas those with high transitivity scores actually report much lower bonding. They feel their network is much more fragmented. So this is interesting. We start, first of all, number one, by actually downloading the networks themselves and looking at the network structure, we're getting a new view. Oh, and this is independent of any behavioral measure. We're getting a new view into how networks work, how people feel about their network. And second of all, we're starting to empirically approach the notion, one of the dark sides of Facebook, the notion of collapsed context. So collapsed context is one of the most, I would suggest, one of the more significant issues on Facebook today, and indeed on any site where people try to draw in multiple connections. It's a real user interface challenge to try to represent multiple social roles, how to actually define what information I'm supposed to put on what site. And it's also something that's really irritating from the point of view of anyone who just wants to give you a friend list and not worry about filters and not worry about privacy and just, you know, ideally make everything public. So Mark Zuckerberg has consistently noted that having two identities for yourself is a lack of integrity, or shows a lack of integrity. This notion that people are being duplicitous when they have multiple identities, denying the notion that I may be very different when I'm up here talking, you know, in lecture style than I am at the pub, or that I, you know, am when I'm home with my family, and so forth. But that's sort of a hindrance rather than a sort of something that we need to think about, consider from a design and a social science and policy perspective. So the modern family, the modern life we may think of, and this is very old, this is from Georg Simmel, a lovely piece called the Partially Intersecting Social Circles of Modern Life, which was then translated into sciencey speak in the 60s as the web of group affiliations. Sounds really networky, right? And then what's more, I guess, contemporary than something that's networky? Social circles. But it's sort of ironic that that was the actual title back in German, but it got mistranslated, and so then we forgot about social circles and these social roles in the process of rereading Simmel. But it's a lovely idea that we do have these partially overlapping social circles, that they're not complete and they do have different roles. But then Facebook will collapse all of them into friends, friends of friends, and everyone. And yes, while it is possible to have a slightly differentiated relationship on Facebook through privacy settings, they tend to be tedious and underused and complicated. So one of the things that I did in my work is examine how individuals perceive their Facebook network, and how when they see their network discussed in terms of these groups, they may perceive it differently, and will they act on it differently. One case is this gentleman here, Bolivar. Bolivar is a recovering person who's in an anonymous group. You know, like, you know, there's lots, not the ones with the masks, the ones with the 12 steps. And Bolivar's anonymous, he's doing really great. Peer support leader. As a peer support leader, people have to contact them when they're having a relapse with their particular issue. And, you know, they're used to contacting people on Facebook. And so they contacted people on Facebook, and he's describing this this issue to me. Now, and here's his view of his network. The anonymous people are completely separate. They're a part of his life that he wants to keep, well, anonymous. And then he has his immediate family, which he tries to keep separate. And then he has these four groups that he says are kind of linked. You know, these partially overlapping social circles. There's a hobby group, a friends from a foreign country, and ex-students and so forth, friends in Oxford. But when you look at his Facebook network, something else emerges that became a sort of problem for him, and one that he couldn't quite put his finger on until he saw the diagram. And that was this sense that he can't simply get rid of those anonymous people as much as he would like to. He can't simply filter them out because they're the purple ones, sorry for the colorblind people, hence the little arrows. They're the purple ones that are connected to the hobby group. It turns out once they come on Facebook, people from his anonymous friends actually discovered that they were friends with other people he knew, thus self-de-anonymizing and also embedding themselves in his web of relations, which made it harder for him to segment. And so this sort of collapsed context issue was very real for him, and then had other sort of spillover effects. Another example of this that's happened is how this was actually one done by Josh Melville, my graduate student during his MSc thesis. He looked at the same issue, and he describes this concern about laser pointers. No laser pointers. Oh, yes, Ben again. The other Ben. Young Ben, not. Or you have a laser pointer too. Your name is Ben, right?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm actually Jenny.
Oh yeah. Is that working? Oh, Ben's totally worked yesterday. Can we pass this down? Come on, teamwork. Because I am not Mr.
Yeah, make sure it's on stone.
That joke works every time, I'm sure. All right. So this group up here, Gaza. These are the student immigrated from the Palestinian territories to the UK to study school. And she has this one group with this one small time, but these are all in the same Facebook group. This is her audience, whether she likes it or not. Now, are her friends aware of her audience and sort of the cultural issues? No. I remember once one of my friends from university posted a link on my wall. And now I'm into sexual politics and gender and stuff like that. He knew I was doing a module on it. So yeah, this link was to a woman's blog with some kind of online sex worker who specialized in weird and creepy fetish porn. I mean, it was all reasonably tasteful because it was her blog and, not a porn site. But, there was nudity and some was pretty hardcore feminist statements about sex and whatever. So yeah, I sort of fell out with him a bit over it because they probably weren't thinking about it. I've got a very religious family back home in Gaza who look at my profile all the time. If one of my young cousins had clicked on that, I won't do the laughter, they would have just thought that it was porn because they don't understand. They wouldn't get it. And I would have been in a lot of trouble. So yeah, I was pretty mad and I had to delete it. An example of the fact that my audience is different from necessarily somebody else's perception of my audience, and that these issues all come to a head as we collapse into this one big flat network that was very beautiful with the blue on black Facebook. And so, yes, returning to our network. So what this has led me to is starting to think about how to reassess social identity online. Moving from a notion that online is about necessarily a logic of performance. This is a pretty consistently used framework for online identity. It comes from Irving Goffman. It's referred to often as the dramaturgical approach, is that we have a front stage and we have a backstage. A front stage is where we seek to do impression management and fulfill a role that is considered appropriate in a specific situation or behavior region. It's the front. And the backstage is where we ready ourselves for that performance. So that in the backstage, I'm furiously, putting the slides together and, complaining about this, and I'm Googling something at the last minute, and I'm looking at a typo, and I'm trying to hide all of that went into the production of this role. So what I do is give you the best, impression. And the front stage, backstage dynamic is something that's been explored a fair bit. It's great as a notion of performance, if not necessarily performativity, a more a recent concept. But it kind of, it doesn't necessarily work great online because online we're not simply performing in front of a bounded situation, just like being in situ right now. Instead, we're submitting artifacts. And yes, the act of submitting an artifact, the act of putting a picture up, or act of commenting, is itself still a performance. But that performance lingers on when we're gone. And that performance is then managed, massaged, curated by a whole host of individuals outside of our control. Facebook has EdgeRank. Different programs have different ways of curating this content. They have privacy settings. And simply noting the identity relationship that we have with our audience masks the role of this third party, these algorithms, that do a substantial amount in regulating who sees what content, and ideally trying to flatten all of that because, well, it's easier to program. And so moving more towards an exhibitional approach where we start thinking about how we submit artifacts that are then curated by third parties is something that I think will help us move towards considering in some ways how performance online may be different from offline, but then of course you can think of different sort of online, offline. I don't want to make too strong a distinction about it, but nevertheless start assessing how this works. And then start thinking, what are the consequences of this? The consequences for public debate, the consequences for self-expression, for social support, for those who need to come out, say as lesbian or gay, to their family and friends. Coming out on Facebook is a tumultuous and terrifying process that's generally at the end of the coming out process that happens long after a lot of exploration on other sites, a lot of exploration using pseudonyms, a lot of browsing and consuming. It is not the first port of call, because once you're out on Facebook, they say you're out, which is not necessarily the case for everywhere on the web. So what does this do? One of the consequences, I assert, is that it drives down, or may drive down, discussion to a lowest common denominator of what's appropriate for individuals in their personal network. I can post a radical leftist or radical rightist politics, but then I will get some sort of comment saying that's not really cool, or I'll have a friend feel uncomfortable, or people will defriend each other. And as a consequence, we start to think of Facebook as a place of sort of sanguine happy talk, relative to perhaps Twitter, where we drive home whatever extreme discursive position we can. This notion of a lowest common denominator and leading to sort of political polarization coming from this is actually being consistently shown in many studies in many places. But I'll give one small taste of this. And the Pew Internet have noted that people do in fact defriend those and censor content. People who post something they disagree with, who post frequently about politics, disagree, argue, and so forth. Differences for both liberals and conservatives, but nevertheless, this is something that people do, and they do in their network, trying to assess what they think is an appropriate audience and act accordingly. So this leads to one last thought on identity from this guy right here, and I'll conclude with this. Anyone here know who this guy is?
Yeah, that's 4chan guy.
It's 4chan guy. Yeah, I'm good. So 4chan guy, known as Moot online. M-O-O-T, started a website, 4chan. I would not go to it right now. Yes, for those of you that didn't laugh, don't go there right now. For those of you that did laugh, you know better. And so 4chan is one of the sort of anonymous sinkholes of content online, and it can be pretty vulgar and pretty nasty, but also really interesting and really creative. And Moot really wanted to defend 4chan, and he got a platform for this in 2009 when he was voted the most influential person online in Time's sort of online poll. Their poll was poorly done in such a way that people could vote multiple times. So people on 4chan set up this sort of gaming system that got very creative, and not only put Moot at the top, but arranged the next 20 in an acrostic that said "Marble Cake, also the game." And yes, so for those of you who not only know 4chan but know the game, you have lost it yet again. For those who don't know the game is to not think about the game. It's like trying not to think of elephants. So Moot has been very adamant in noting that we need not drive ourselves into a single online expression. That 4chan, the reason that LOL cats and all sorts of fun creative culture come out of 4chan is because it allows people to fail. It allows people to try on new ideas and allows them to express themselves in ways that are constrained in their personal network. Now 4chan is a bit anarchic, which is why in its most recent project, you still have to sign in with an identity. You are known to the moderators, but you're not known to the other people. You can choose whatever identity you want, but he does want to avoid people putting up very nasty things. And he has this lovely quote that he gave at, I believe it was South by Southwest, and that kind of puts him in the position of anti-Zuckerberg. And this is his, he's asserting that Google and Facebook, Google and Facebook would have you believe that you're a mirror, but we're actually more like diamonds. Look from a different angle and you see something completely different. We have different facets of our personality that need not be constrained, put together, repersonalized, customized, and filtered into one single box. But that the online space is a really open place where we can express ourselves, acquire different kinds of resources, and explore it in different ways. So, and I guess I've given you a taste of how that's been done on Facebook, how we may do it elsewhere, and I look forward to seeing how you approach it in the future. So that's it. Thanks to my colleagues in all these different places. Hooray, all the help they've given, and thank you.
All right. Yo, take on the questions.
So you talked about how people are very careful about what they put on Facebook because they can't distinguish between different groups of friends and acquaintances, but that they're willing to be much more polarizing and such on Twitter, which is completely public and has no controls.
Yeah. And this is, it's really neat. It's really weird. And so we're exploring that at, and it does seem to be the case. We're exploring that at the OII. Well, one issue is that there's more of a personal connection. The other is that Facebook assumes a single name as opposed to a pseudonym. But we did an experiment. Neil Basu, my master's student, did this great Facebook app experiment, sort of an A/B testing type of thing, where download 30 of your most recent statuses, 30 most recent statuses posted on your wall by somebody else. And then we gave them 2 prompts. The first prompt was, an employer wants to look at your Facebook page. Click on the post that you want to hide. The second was, Facebook is going to turn every post public. Click on the posts you want to hide. So, first of all, do people censor more of their own posts or more posts of other people? Are your friends the problem, or is it you?
You.
It's you. It was weird. I mean, there was lots of variance, and some people was more friends, but on the whole, people were censoring more of their own posts than others. But more interestingly, are they censoring more posts in the employer situation or the everything's completely public situation?
Employer.
The employer. And like, yes, employer is a subset of everyone. But employer is also a more salient threat. And individuals on Facebook are concerned with salient threats, and not just Facebook. Alice Marwick and Dana Boyd, Dana was at Webshop, wasn't she, back in the day? I think too. Was she your? I somehow vaguely remember her being. But she's super Dana. So I mean, if you haven't come across her work, you will. But her and Alice Marwick in this paper on Twitter talk about nightmare friends. This notion that there's these specific people who are really salient threats in our network, and we respond to those. And I've sort of, in a cheeky way, tried to fold that into this exhibition metaphor that we're not just posting to our audience, but to these wandering critics that can just cause disaster everywhere. And we're posting not for the critics, but in light of the fact that these critics might be there. And as we come up with salient threats, mom's on Facebook, my boss is on Facebook, they start to color our self-censorship in ways that are not so salient on all public, all the time sites. And I'm not really sure why, but it does seem to work that way thus far. Someone else moderate, because I can't judge. Oh, I think yours was first.
Well, mine's more of a ongoing comment, I guess, on what you were just saying in relation between Facebook and Twitter. It goes back to kind of our previous discussion with Elizabeth, talking about the real world or the face-to-face kind of interactions that we have regarding Facebook or regarding our internet clicks, where it's not just clicks, it actually is face-to-face relationships, which Facebook, in comparison to Twitter often has more of these kind of face-to-face interactions where your mom will call you after you have a post. And then, and thinking about how we regulate our exhibition, we're thinking about what are the kind of audiences that we do have to, will kind of become part of our day-to-day conversation, as well as the people who are across the globe and aren't just clicking and kind of browsing through.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And while treading dangerously towards tech determinist territory, I would like to think that there is a fundamental distinction between sites that have bidirectional links, where we both have to agree, and sites that have asymmetric links. So we can think of LinkedIn and Facebook as these ones where I befriend you and we have to agree on that, so we have to have a mutual acknowledgement of our relationship, as behaving different than sites such as Twitter and Google+, where you don't have to have that bidirectional relationship. And of course on Twitter and Google+, some people can have, a million friends, whereas on Facebook you cannot, or they limit it. But even then, people tend to have fewer friends on Facebook than they do followers on Twitter. And I do think that that plays out differently. These small little design decisions fundamentally start framing sites in different ways, and framing them. Facebook claims itself as a social utility, for example. Not a social network site, it's a utility. And these decisions guide people, whether you're allowed to use a real name or a pseudonym. They guide people into different ways of expressing. And the fallout from that, it's not necessarily deterministic, but it does guide people into specific patterns of behavior. Also, the power of defaults.
Follow up on that. So why is this tendency to be positive and nice and cute and like nobody posts on that they sucked or like there's no dislike,
People
right?
do.
Discuss. Like there's no dislike button.
Yeah, but you know, even though there's no dislike button, what's really fun is to go to open status search, which is a way of checking out the things that people write publicly, and just search for dislike button. There's lots of people saying, I wish there was a dislike button. It's like, oh, my dog died. And you know, I wish there was a dislike button, but I'm really so sorry. And of course, Google tries a more neutral approach with the +1, and you know, Twitter retweets, which is ways of suggesting, also related to the asymmetric thing, that they're attention regulation areas. They're trying to diffuse information rather than to identity regulation. We're trying to say, here's me and my identity and what I think is positive and appropriate. Yeah, if you go to status search and look for that, you see lots of comments saying, I wish there was a dislike button because of that you know, inability to do that. But it's a very deliberate decision, and it's meant to make things more positive. And that's what works in in that social network. I don't know how we are. We're
Let's
all...
take one more, sir.
Okay.
No, we're okay.
Okay. All right. First hand. Ultimate Fighting. Ultimate
Blue
Fighting.
face, who hasn't spoken?
What about the sort of bifurcation between various social media sites? So you present, a family network on Facebook, but your professional network on Twitter, but your hobby relationship on Pinterest. I mean, did
Yeah.
you sort of go over the use of naming and anonymous?
So Josh Melville, who I've mentioned here a couple times, that's his interest is in what is the true social network? Is there a true social network? Can we represent that from what we get across all these sites? We know that it's not just, we want to keep things hidden from people because, it's terrorism or whatever, but that people have legitimate sort of interest in regulating content. But so is there a true social network amongst all of these? If you merge them all together, merge them with email, what do you come up with? Where do people want to go? Because it's an open question right now. Most people are not necessarily even doing studies on personal networks, let alone on personal networks across different sites, but it's really ripe for analysis. I did it with different media, so cell phones, instant messenger, and so forth in my dissertation. But up here, it's still just all kind of hovering in Facebook territory, but I would love to see more work on under what conditions do people use which site, and start coming up with sort of perhaps heuristics as to why that's the case, and also senses of success. But my last plug on that is I think that there's still a lot of room for exploration and discovery in the client side. In me, I suck all this information down and I manage it. I think the future is in mobile devices that do this. Apple's now doing this, Google's now doing this. You look at your address book, and it's now a turbocharged social media hub with Facebook and Twitter and everything, and not just phone numbers. It's not dull. And so there's a lot to be said for taking that power back by I am the keeper and manager of all of my different networks. But where that's going to go, I'd love to see.
All right. Whoa.